Broadcasting to all. I think we have a recording as well. So you have 24 people on so far. Welcome everyone that's joined. Just wait until 2 o'clock to begin. Hi, Alan. I see that you just joined.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
It's a little low.
What I might do is join by the cell phone then.
Okay.
I can hear you pretty well.
Yeah, it just got better.
Yeah, much
Oh,
better.
it did get better?
Yeah,
Yes.
you sound
Okay.
very clear. Yep.
So 31 people. Give it, say, like 1 more minute.
Okay. Well, the last minute logistics, right?
Of course. And everyone fashionably late to join. All right, so we'll begin. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this webinar on the EPA's draft risk evaluation for asbestos, geological, toxicologic, and legal implications deep dive that myself, Clifford Pasquarella, will be hosting as moderating with Alan Seagrave and Evan Beckett as panelists. A little background on myself. I'm an attorney at CMBG3 Law in Boston. I'm licensed in Massachusetts. I've been so since 2015, although I have more than a decade of experience in asbestos litigation. I've worked for another prominent firm with a national reputation in the asbestos litigation as well. I currently defend a talc-based product manufacturer as their national counsel, and also defend locally a diverse group of equipment manufacturers. Our panelist, Alan Seagrave, is our subject matter expert on geology and mineralogy. He is the principal scientist of Seagrave Technical Consulting, Inc. His background includes approximately 34 years of experience performing analysis on air, dust, and bulk samples. He's familiar with characterizing minerals such as asbestos and talc using microscopy methods such as PCM, PLM, TEM, and SCM. And he is also a consultant in litigation. Evan Beckett is our subject matter expert as to toxicology and industrial hygiene. Evan has approximately 7 years of experience as a toxicologist and certified industrial hygienist. He performs risk assessments on toxins such as asbestos in environmental and occupational settings. He's qualified to speak on epidemiology and the studies, and he is also a consultant in litigation. Now, we're here to discuss the implications and conclusions in the draft risk analysis issued by EPA for asbestos. And really, there are a lot of conclusions in this very lengthy document that can be really put into two different categories. And that is, one, the risk level for chrysotile is much closer to the risk level of amphibole asbestos than previously thought. And two, there is limited to no risk from environmental exposures to asbestos. Now, we're really going to focus in this webinar on key point number one, but also just keep in mind that second point as well, because that will come up later in the webinar. But just for a brief background on the status of EPA's promulgation review of its risk analysis for asbestos. In March 2020, it released its draft risk evaluation for asbestos. And from that point of its issuance in March through about June, they received many public comments from trade groups, scientists, interested parties in litigation with regard to the findings, principally the finding that chrysotile is a more increased risk in relation to amphibole asbestos, and other findings as well within the data and conclusions in that document. On June 8th through 11th, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Chemicals, also known as SAC, held a public hearing where these comments from similar trade groups, scientists, litigation groups, came and presented why they had their comments regarding some of the findings or any findings that they had criticisms, critiques, or comments on. On November 1st, or this month, the nomination period for additional members to that SAC closed, and EPA actually released a list of 61 nominees for the additional 15 spots on that committee. There's now a deadline of October 30th, so just about 10 days away from now, for the public to submit comments with regard to those potential nominees. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the webinar. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and transition over to Alan Seagrave, who will be discussing with us the geologic, mineralogic considerations with regard to asbestos and chrysotile, followed by Evan Beckett, who will take that information and talk about the biologic effects. And I will speak lastly about the legal ramifications of everything that Alan and Evan have spoken on. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Clifford. See if I can get my screen going here. Can everyone see this first slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, my talk is really going to focus on some of the mechanisms of the formation of chrysotile and just give you some background on some of the microscopy of these materials, but then I'll also touch on the amphibole and some of the differences as well. This rock here, I took a photo of this back in 2014, doing some work up in Vermont, and this is a rock called peridotite. It comes deep from the mantle of the earth, gets pushed up during mountain building, and through an exacting set of conditions, this rock can either form talc, it can form chrysotile asbestos or other serpentine-based minerals, or it can produce both at the same time. So we'll get into that a little bit. Some of the mountainous belts along eastern United States, we'll look at that a little bit, along with how different, but yet very similar, some of the mechanisms of chrysotile formation arise in Italy, Vermont, Canada as examples. And then looking at the structure of chrysotile and how unique that mineral can be when compared to the other polymorphs of serpentine, and utilizing some of the microscopy techniques to characterize these minerals. And really, the chrysotile is really the perfect mineral for examination under the microscope. at least in terms of characterization, using polarized light microscopy and then electron microscopy. Talk a little bit about chrysotile used in asbestos products and some of the binders and different things that make a product what a product is. And then just touching over into the amphiboles and some concluding statements. So really, when you look at chrysotile formation, O'Hanley really came up with several models in '88, but these go way back in the 40s and even earlier. The precursor rock is really rich in magnesium and iron, such as peridotite, olivine, and even some of the pyroxenes. And that undergoes during the rock formation a process called serpentinization. And that's really, depending on the reactive pathways of the various constituents, the amount of iron, the pressure, the temperature, and also the development of CO2 and hydrogen and methane, you can get a variety of rock assemblages or very large assemblages of one mineral. So Hanley broke that down into alpine peridotites, differentiated sills, serpentinized limestones, or a combination. And the main thing to remember is, as a geologist, when you go out into the field, you can see signs of these development mechanisms along with the rock types, and then make some conclusions about how chrysotile, for example, formed. And also the mechanisms such as cross fiber, slip fiber. And if you're looking at mining this material, then which one is going to be economically viable to mass produce the chrysotile. And if you think of California, to your left of the screen, going west, and you can see the Franciscan assemblage. And of course, California is a very large mass of serpentine or serpentinite, where the continental plate collided with the oceanic plate. It's still occurring to this day. It formed the Sierra Nevada mountains, but you also get mixtures of the oceanic crust along with the continental crust and form very complex deformed mountains or rocks, such as in this picture on the left. You can see this north of the Golden Gate Bridge, Franciscan formation, and you can get some very distorted rock types, but they all have that one thing in common, typically a greenish color. And to the right, you can start to see the fractures that have been filled in with some of the chrysotile. On the eastern United States, same sort of thing. You get the Appalachians forming, and Van Goosen looked at this back in 2006 for similar signs to what produces asbestos in these different rocks. And if you follow the mountain chain generally up on into Vermont and Canada, you can find quite a few deposits that have indications of asbestos. Eden, Vermont was a fairly large chrysotile mine. I went there, I think in 2004. They had already shut it down, but you could see from the runoff of rain and weathering into the low-lying areas, slick deposits, mud flats of pure chrysotile that had been sorted by the rainwater and so forth. And I think about 7% of the rock mass was considered chrysotile. So it gives you an idea of how much spoils. You can see the large mountain of tailings to derive the chrysotile. And then Belangero on the right one of the largest, I think if not the largest chrysotile mine in the world, later filled in with a lake there. This is Thetford, another large chrysotile mine that was closed recently. And it just gives you the scale of some of the material that could be exploited. So if you look at some of the polymorphs of serpentine, on the left, antigerite, lizardite, and then of course chrysotile, same chemistry, but the crystalline structure determines the mineral. And on the right, you can start to see three different structural features. The antigerite has almost a cross lattice feature. Lizardite is more of a platy type of the tetrahedral and octahedral sheets. But chrysotile scrolls, and in nature, the various pressure and temperature, along with filling in void spaces and rocks, forms that unique scrolling nature, but in a way that makes it somewhat susceptible to mechanical degradation as well as chemical degradation. And for those that may not know this, chrysotile also has two other polymorphs, which nobody ever talks about. The one we commonly see is clinochrysotile, gives the unique diffraction patterns on the electron microscope, which I'll show you in a minute. But orthochrysotile and parachrysotile are structurally slightly different. They don't give you those patterns, and you probably don't see this in nature too much, but they are out there. And the question I've always come up with is, when you see this, is it regulated? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's retains the asbestiform habit. It's found in many different commercial goods. And on the lower right there, you can see the scrolling texture or habit, and it, in an elongate fashion, which gives rise to the asbestiform habit. And that alternating hydroxyl and magnesium and oxygen, along with the silica tetrahedron. So we all have heard about what's asbestos and what is asbestiform, and this came right out of the EPA 93 method, really giving the microscopists the first real guidelines to categorizing what constitutes asbestiform habit, such as parallel fibers and bundles, very long aspect ratios for long fibers, greater than 5 microns, but also matted masses of fibers. And you can see pictures of this on the right, very diagnostic. PLM, of course, can give you different optical properties that also are diagnostic, such as birefringence, sign of elongation and extinction. TEM, you get morphology. Chrysotile is always going to be in the asbestiform habit. Crystal structure is diagnostic, and then the elemental composition to give you a confirmation. SEM, you can't get electron diffraction, but you can certainly make nice pictures of the asbestiform habit and also get chemistry. In Europe, for example, SEM is the method of choice for many countries. I think France is one of the few that went with TEM. So here's a nice, perfect chrysotile pattern, and you can see certain reflections in this pattern that are diagnostic of chrysotile. And it's not to say that you get this all the time, but you should be able to get this if you have numerous fibers in a sample. And of course, the elemental chemistry, I might point out, if you look at the red markers there for magnesium, it looks higher than silica. And you really can't go by a visual. This is the light element detector. The magnesium is always going to look higher than the silicon. But when you go to quantify in the bottom, you can see the magnesium is actually much less than the silicon. So that is a mistake that I've seen some analysts try to do, where they say the magnesium is greater than the silicon. When we talk about products, it's interesting that in that document, when I read through it, I never saw mention of the 700,000 plus buildings that still contain asbestos in the United States, estimated from previous EPA documents. And the other thing that I noticed was the lack of mention of 600,000 miles of asbestos cement pipe. So I think just to make everyone aware that this stuff is in a lot of different products, it's in a lot of different buildings. But then if you look at the types of chrysotile that are used in these products, grade lengths 3 to 19 millimeters in length, and they all have certain applications for those lengths, like woven cloth or textiles, brake linings, or maybe it was ground up and it was used, in asphalt compounds or gaskets or paints. Floor tiles, for example, were I think calidria was used frequently in different floor tiles because it was relatively short compared to the other types of chrysotile. Just to touch on amphiboles, the double chain silicate, right away you've got the basis for forming a pretty durable material. And then the crystal system, almost all the amphiboles except enthophyllite are the monoclinic crystal system, which really doesn't mean that much except to the microscopist. But in a way it does, because it serves the crystal arrangement where certain elements are only going to occupy certain sites in that crystal structure. And because of that, we can classify the various maybe 190 plus amphiboles out there that also can occur in non-asbestiform or asbestiform habit. But we can classify those on the basis of chemistry. These sites, like the M and A sites, the T sites, can only hold so much element based on the element. And because of that, the structure, while being the same, the elemental composition changes. And so if you look at this chart, you can start to take the International Mineralogical Association classification, and you can start to see how difficult it can be to take a technique on the TM, such as EDS, which has quite a bit of error associated with it, and try to classify amphiboles that you may be seeing in a material that was really done by very exacting techniques to get specific percentages of elements like lithium or sodium, for example. So just wanted to kind of touch on that to show that amphiboles are a different animal versus chrysotile, which is, again, fairly diagnostic on the TM or PLM, but really doesn't change much compared to amphibole. So we can illustrate that a little bit. Enstatite is a pyroxene, enthophyllite, and then talc, all the same elemental chemistry, even chrysotile, same elemental chemistry, at least by the EDS technique I just mentioned. But then you start to get crystal structure, and you can start to see talc and chrysotile typically going to give you those patterns, if you will. But enstatite and enthophyllite can overlap, and you can get some misdiagnosis that way. So one has to be a little careful, and that's where skill and experience comes into play. And then when we talk about looking at things under the microscope, if you see a single fiber, for example, in 2 dimensions, if you're looking down on these structures, you know, they can give the appearance of being a fiber, but in reality, as you rotate or turn those, they're really not fibers at all that would be counted by that method. They're really different shapes of particles that just happen to lie along a crystal face that gives the appearance that you're looking at that fiber. And again, going back to the asbestiform and rock fragments or non-asbestiform, that the big takeaway here is at the bottom paragraph is you really have to look at a population of fibers before you can start to conclude that, okay, I think I have a population of asbestiform materials here. And the other thing EPA did, which I liked in '93 when they updated the 82 documents, is they said that you really needed to consider use of a secondary technique to confirm what you've identified. And I think that as a microscopist, I've seen situations where you think it's one thing and then you get on another microscope, another technique, and you've now confirmed something completely different. So just something to keep aware of, that chrysotile, as unique as it is, sometimes can be misclassified as well. And the testing, again, if you look at rock fragments, can give the appearance of being asbestiform, but under closer examination, you know, such as tilting or using the population characteristics, you really have confirmed a non-asbestiform material. Here's a good example. This mineral was taken out of the Italian talc mines in a non-talc rock. The top photo is hornblende. You can see a very angular particle. The chemistry associated with it that could be misinterpreted as tremolite, but the aluminum content is just a little too high. But the real clincher for me was the inter-row spacing of 5.1 angstroms, amphiboles being about 5.4 angstroms. So you had some disorder in the crystal structure, which is indicative of the higher aluminum content. And then if you ground up some of these different minerals, the non-asbestiform and asbestiform tremolite, unlike chrysotile always being in the asbestiform habit, the amphiboles typically, you can start to see in this example, on the photo on the left, you have a high population of extremely long, thin fibers. The one on the right, you do have some elongate fibers, but primarily shards and shorter aspect ratio type particles. Another photo. So counting rules for chrysotile, this is very straightforward. For amphiboles, not so much. You know, if you have a single fiber and you're not having these complex structures that you typically have with chrysotile, the count is fairly straightforward with amphibole, but not so much with chrysotile. So if I just wrap it up a little bit, some of the hello? Somebody screamed out. So the geological mechanisms for chrysotile are fairly well understood. Different pressure and temperature regimes can give rise to the formation of the chrysotile. And some of the examples we saw with Canada, Vermont, Italy, and then the unique characteristics of chrysotile are fairly well suited for microscopy. The dimensional data and purity of the material is also important in health studies. And then shape and dimensional characteristics that are defined between amphiboles, asbestiform and rock fragments. And proper classification of these materials does require some skill in applied mineralogy. And touching back onto chrysotile products, particularly in buildings and cement water piping, being two areas that I think are of concern, and the variable length in chrysotile products. So I think we'll hold questions, I guess, till the end. I think, Cliff, is that correct?
Yes, we'll hold questions until the end.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll turn it over back to Cliff then.
And next we'll have Evan Beckett present on the biologic considerations with regard to the information that Alan so eloquently went through during the geology of chrysotile and asbestos minerals. I think you're on mute, Evan.
Yep, sorry, I was just trying to figure out where that was. Can you see my screen okay?
Just fine.
Okay, great. So thanks, and I'll just give a really brief introduction, as in I know we're going to be a little over time here, but I'm Evan Beckett. I'm a health scientist with Cardno Chemrisk, and I have a master's in toxicology from the University of Michigan. And I'm a certified industrial hygienist by the American Board of Industrial Hygiene. My principal area of expertise is risk evaluation with a focus on toxicology and industrial hygiene, and I have a significant amount of experience in asbestos litigation work. So just a quick outline, I'm going to discuss the fiber potency implications related to fiber type and fiber length of asbestos, as well as the implications of asbestos encapsulation and products. And then I'm going to discuss the EPA TSCA risk evaluation for asbestos, and I'll provide a quick overview of the general regulation, the conditions of future use that were evaluated, some of the epidemiological cohorts that they relied upon, as well as some major methodological flaws of the evaluation. So the first factor that influences fiber potency is fiber type. And as Alan described earlier, asbestos is composed of two distinct mineralogical groups, serpentine asbestos and amphibole asbestos. And I'm going to be way less detailed than Alan was here, but the main serpentine fiber type and most common fiber type is chrysotile, while the most notable amphibole fiber types include amosite and chrysotolite, as well as some various others. So one of the more important factors relating to differences in fiber type is the structural integrity of fibers when exposed to an acidic environment. So when chrysotile is exposed to an acidic environment, it readily disintegrates due to disruptions of the structural integrity of the fiber. And conversely, for amphibole fibers, even though acidic conditions can deplete the weak bonds between fibers in a bundle, individual fibers that remain are highly resistant to further dissolution. And most also important is that these fibers don't decrease in length as they dissociate. So what does this mean for the lungs when these fibers are inhaled? So for chrysotile, these fibers are typically curly and pliable, and upon inhalation, they dissolve fairly readily. And this leads to a short residence in the lung on the order of days to weeks, which presents little time to cause damaging effects. Amphiboles, on the other hand, are usually straight and flexible and needle-like, and upon inhalation, they dissolve very slowly, which leads to a longer residence period in the lung on the order of years to decades. And this presents a long time for adverse biological processes, such as inflammation, to occur, which can therefore lead to asbestos-related disease. So fiber type and differential persistence in the lung are the main factors that influence potency differences between chrysotile and amphibole asbestos. So the weight of the evidence indicates that amphibole asbestos is far more potent at inducing mesothelioma than chrysotile. And there is general consensus, including among panels historically funded by EPA, that amosite is about 100 times more potent for mesothelioma than chrysotile, while chrysotolite is estimated to be about 500 times more potent. And these potency differences are extremely important when evaluating risk associated with asbestos exposure, as short exposures to amphibole fibers can potentially lead to an increased risk for asbestos-related disease, even when the majority of exposure is to chrysotile. So the other major factor that affects potency for asbestos-related disease is fiber length. And the impact of fiber length on toxicity has been evaluated in countless animal tox studies. And the weight of the tox evidence suggests that fibers greater than 20 microns in length are associated with toxicity, while fibers greater than or less than or equal to 8 microns in length are not associated with toxicity. And there's generally consensus that asbestos fibers less than 5 microns in length, regardless of fiber type, have no pathogenic potential in rodents. And just to orient you to some of the lengths that we're dealing with here, the average width of a human hair is about 100 microns. So these lengths are very small or very short, and these fibers likely cannot be detected by the naked eye. And so one of the prevailing theories for increased potency of longer fibers involves a phenomenon called frustrated phagocytosis. And depicted here are two different images of pulmonary macrophages that are attempting to engulf a single amphibole asbestos fiber. And these macrophages are essentially white blood cells that are tasked with clearing debris from the lung. And the diameter of a macrophage on average is only about 20 microns. And so because the asbestos fiber length in these photos is much longer than the diameter of the macrophage cannot clear the fiber. And this can lead to increased inflammation in the area, and that can then lead to downstream adverse effects, such as cancer. And so you can start to see why longer fibers are more likely to cause disease compared to shorter fibers. Now, government and authoritative groups have acknowledged and in fact concluded that there's a difference in potency based on fiber length. And so this is not a fringe theory in asbestos science at all. For example, ATSDR, which is a subgroup of CDC, convened a panel in 2002 and which concluded that asbestos fibers less than 5 microns in length are unlikely to cause cancer in humans. Similarly, EPA convened an expert panel in 2003, and they concluded that risk associated with asbestos fibers less than 5 microns is very low and could be zero. And then simultaneously, EPA also convened a group in 2003 that established that the fiber length cutoff for potency is greater than 10 to 20 microns in length, such that fibers longer than this cutoff are more likely to cause disease than fibers shorter than this cutoff. So when used in products, chrysotile is separated into different grades based on fiber length, as Alan mentioned earlier. So grades 1 through 3, which are longer fibers, are typically incorporated into products that need the good tensile strength properties of long fiber chrysotile, like textiles. And grades 4 through 7 are shorter and are incorporated into products along with other binding materials to take advantage of the insulating, absorbing, friction, and matrix reinforcement properties. And this is in products such as cement pipe, brakes, clutches, and gaskets, which are at issue in this TSCA evaluation. Specifically, grade 7 chrysotile is predominantly less than 5 microns in length, which is, as a reminder, the non-potent length. Grade 7 chrysotile is historically incorporated into brakes, clutches, and gaskets, but it's encapsulated into resins and other binders during the product molding process. And the weight of the evidence suggests that exposure to encapsulated asbestos or chrysotile does not lead to an increased risk for asbestos-related disease. And this phenomenon was appreciated by OSHA back in 1972 when they promulgated the first asbestos standard. And they have since never required warning labels on products in which asbestos is encapsulated. So how are these factors relevant to the EPA asbestos risk evaluation? So just an overview of the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. This was signed into law in June of 2016 after broad support for amendment of the corresponding regulation in 1976. So this is a forward-looking regulation that is interested in assessing risk for future exposures to hazardous materials. And they set deadlines for action on priority substances like asbestos, require a risk-based evaluation instead of cost-benefit, and new chemicals entering commerce have to undergo risk evaluation before being introduced. In terms of the EPA asbestos risk evaluation, the process is a little bit difficult to follow, which is one of the limitations of the draft document. Briefly though, EPA limited the evaluation to chrysotile, as this is the only fiber type that's expected to be used in commerce moving forward. And in order to understand the relationship between chrysotile exposure and risk for mesothelioma and lung cancer, they pulled the exposure risk data from epidemiological studies and fit a linear model or linear trend line to the data. And an example of this is depicted on the right of the slide. So the slope of this line gives the risk per unit exposure. And for asbestos, that unit exposure is fiber per cubic centimeter or fibers per cc. So then, EPA performs some mathematical gymnastics of some kind that is outside of my expertise to combine the inhalation unit risk data for mesothelioma and lung cancer, while also factoring in an assumption for an exposure over a lifetime in order to develop an inhalation unit risk of 0.16 per fiber per cc. That is, your risk increases by 0.16 arbitrary risk units for every fiber per cc exposure. And so using this inhalation unit risk, EPA calculated risk for individual conditions of use, which mostly involved different applications of work with brakes, clutches, and gaskets. And the rudimentary formula that they used was essentially the multiplication of the inhalation unit risk, as described previously, and exposure data for a specific scenario in units of fiber per cc. And this gives them a risk for that condition of use. Then they compared the risk level that they derived to two different benchmark risk levels. For workers, the benchmark risk level was 1 per 1,000, or 10,000 for workers. And for consumers, the benchmark risk level was 1 per million. And as a quick example calculation, I decided to use the OSHA permissible exposure limit. And so I multiplied the IUR times the OSHA permissible exposure limit. And this actually led to a level that exceeded the benchmark risk for workers, suggesting that work at the permissible exposure limit leads to an unreasonable risk. And incidentally, their model actually indicates that breathing ambient air in an urban environment also is an unreasonable risk. So you can start to see that there's some potential flaws with their evaluation, and it indicates that they may not have attempted to validate their results against the existing literature. And so based on that, it should come as no surprise that EPA reported unreasonable risks associated with occupational, consumer, and bystander use of brakes, clutches, and gaskets in a variety of applications. And so this evaluation has what I like to call a layer of flaws that I think, in my opinion, render the entire evaluation relatively unreliable, particularly for forward-looking exposure potential. And the most important flaw involves the selection of epidemiological cohorts that were used as the basis of the inhalation unit risk derivation. And there are additional issues with the risk evaluation, such as the dose response model that they selected, and then issues related to their exposure assessment. But the major problems was in the epidemiological cohorts that they selected. And unfortunately, that pulls the chair out essentially from the rest of the evaluation. And so just to dig in a little bit about the cohorts that they selected, they used one major selection criteria for this process, that the exposure was chrysotile only and that there was no amphibole asbestos exposure. And based on these criteria, they selected the North Carolina textile cohort for mesothelioma risk and the South Carolina textile cohort for lung cancer risk. So for the North Carolina textile cohort, mesothelioma was evaluated in these plants. And the cohort was comprised of 4 separate plants. In plants 1 and 2, there were no cases observed. And in plants 3 and 4, you started to see some asbestos-related disease cases. So this heterogeneous distribution of disease suggests that there's a differential exposure across the plants. So when you dig into this, if you look at plants 1 and 2, only chrysotile was used, and there were no cases reported. While in plants 3 and 4, amosite and or crucidolite was used historically, and this is where you start to see these cases. So there's clearly an influence of fiber type in the risk estimate. For the South Carolina textile cohort, lung cancer mortality was evaluated, and the authors actually reported an increased risk of lung cancer. It should be noted, though, that the cigarette smoking histories of the cohort members were unknown, which is very problematic when evaluating lung cancer. As we know, cigarette smoking is highly associated with lung cancer development. In addition, crucidolite was used in this facility for 25 years. This is reported in the literature. And actually, the facility had close proximity to the Charleston Naval Shipyard, where a lot of amosite was used historically during the World War II era. And so it's unsurprising that some lung digestion studies reported that about a third of the cohort members had excessive amosite and or crucidolite present in their lungs. And so there's a disconnect here. So EPA's selected cohorts are not relevant to the exposure scenarios they evaluated. They used textile cohorts with mixed fiber exposures, chrysotile fibers 20 to 40 microns in length, and that were producing friable products that potentially lead to high exposure. And they applied it to scenarios involving brakes, clutches, and gaskets, which are chrysotile only exposures, fibers that are less than 5 microns in length, and that are encapsulated in resins, leading to minimal exposure. And so what makes EPA's decision-making in this regard even more puzzling is the existence of data that is actually more representative of the scenarios that they're trying to evaluate. Specifically, as and Alan covered this briefly, EPA ignored the Belangero and Quebec chrysotile mining cohorts, where there's limited to no amphibole exposure. Similarly, they completely disregarded the availability of brake mechanic epidemiology studies, of which there are many. And particularly, there's several meta-analyses that indicate that brake mechanics are not at an increased risk of asbestos-related disease. And these weren't even cited in the evaluation. So it becomes pretty apparent that EPA did not even attempt to validate their risk model against existing data. There's also some modeling issues, particularly related to the dose response model that they selected. So EPA assumed that the exposure response was linear and that there was no threshold for disease. And they also assumed there's no background risk of meso, which we know not to be true. And this is problematic because there are published cumulative chrysotile thresholds for both mesothelioma and lung cancer published incidentally by one of my colleagues. And so this suggests that it's actually a threshold related disease and not a linear exposure response relationship. There's also some very basic issues with the exposure data that they used. Most notably, asbestos-containing brakes, clutches, and gaskets are mostly unavailable in commerce except in very rare applications. And given that TSCA is a forward-looking regulation, the use of this exposure data associated with work with asbestos-containing products is simply not relevant. Moreover, most of the existing exposure data is relevant to maintenance techniques that were used over 60 years ago, and engineering controls today are far superior. And regardless, even if these products still contained chrysotile, work with these products would still not result in exposure that would be expected to lead to an increased risk for disease. And speaking of exposure, when you compare the cumulative chrysotile exposure over a working lifetime to health-related benchmarks, it becomes even more obvious that the conclusions made by EPA are flawed. So among mechanics, cumulative exposure during work with brakes and clutches with and without engineering controls are very low. Similarly, work with gaskets leads to a similar cumulative exposure. However, when compared to a working lifetime at the OSHA PEL, you can see that these cumulative exposures are an order of magnitude lower. And when compared to the chrysotile specific thresholds for lung cancer and mesothelioma, as reported by Pierce et al., these exposures are several magnitudes lower than these thresholds for disease. And so these results are consistent with the epidemiology literature that indicates that brake mechanics and gasket workers are not at an increased risk for disease. So in summary, the epidemiological cohorts on which EPA relied are not relevant to chrysotile only exposure scenarios. The models that they use disregard existing publications related to dose response for chrysotile, and the potential for exposure to chrysotile moving forward is essentially vanishingly low. However, even if these products still contain asbestos, there would be no risk for asbestos-related disease. And in my opinion, this regulation does not really move the needle at all when it comes to prospective or retrospective risk assessments for chrysotile. And that's all I have. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me or we can address them now.
We'll leave the Q&A until the end.
Okay.
We're running a little behind schedule, but I think we have enough. Notice we have a couple of questions coming already. So I will share my screen. And ladies and gentlemen, for the non-scientists on call and like myself, there are a lot of very important things that you have to keep in mind when it comes to these very complex technical aspects that Alan and Evan just went over, particularly the mineralogical differences between chrysotile and amosite asbestos minerals, and then the biologic differences in the way that the body responds to chrysotile versus an amphibole mineral. And as a consequence of that, through litigation, we've created, or the lawyers have created, what's called the chrysotile defense. Based upon the literature and all the studies to date, the essentially what the defense is based on a few pillars. That is, excuse me. Four pillars, four cornerstones of the chrysotile defense. That is, the product only contained chrysotile asbestos at issue. Chrysotile is unequivocally less potent than amphibole asbestos. 3, it is disputed whether chrysotile exposure can cause mesothelioma. 4, specifically when it comes to the individual plaintiff's exposure, if they were exposed to chrysotile, it was a low dose exposure. And again, these 4 cornerstones that come up in asbestos litigation are in response and come up with because of all of the scientific research that has been done, as Alan and Evan showed, that chrysotile is different from amphibole asbestos and is not as potent, and frankly disputed whether in certain forms, whether it's potent at all to cause disease. And in courtrooms, I'm just going to go through some cases that kind of highlight the way the chrysotile defense has been used. And at the end, go over the potential impacts of the EPA's draft risk analysis if its current form is finalized the way it looks. This first case is Yates v. Ford Motor Company. It involved friction products, brakes, in the District Court of the Eastern District of North Carolina. The defendant in this case successfully was able to win this case by showing that the plaintiff expert testimony regarding visible dust failed to distinguish between the different types of asbestos, given that chrysotile is less potent than amphibole asbestos. And further, the plaintiff expert failed to show a general exposure level to chrysotile that could cause a mesothelioma, and failed to account for studies that showed that performing brake work, like the plaintiff did in this case, actually did not show any link to mesothelioma. And again, you can see here from what Alan and Evan described, the scientific analysis between the geology and the bioresponse, that the whole chrysotile defense turns on showing at least a general level of threshold of exposure, and then comparing that threshold exposure to the plaintiff's individual exposure. And here in this case, in Yates, visible dust was not precise enough to even establish a general level of exposure. Moving on, the Smith v. Kelly-Moore Paint Co. case is the case in Texas where Texas adopted the chrysotile defense. In this case, plaintiff experts relied on studies that didn't focus on just chrysotile exposures. Again, the lack of differentiation between chrysotile as a different type of asbestos with different biological effects and amphibole asbestos. Plaintiff's experts relied on flawed studies of plasterers that were incomparable to the plaintiff's own exposure. Ergo, you could not compare a general threshold value to what the plaintiff's own exposure was. And third, comments in OSHA's permissible exposure limit indicating that studies of chrysotile are inconclusive as to what level creates an elevated risk of mesothelioma. That goes back to Evan's point that when OSHA originally promulgated its asbestos regulations, that they did not require a warning for any encapsulated chrysotile asbestos. Next, the Nolan v. Weil-McLean case, Illinois case involving a boiler. So now you can see a very diverse group of products that the chrysotile defense can be applied to. At brakes, boilers, and in this case, the defendant successfully actually appealed a plaintiff verdict at trial by arguing that they weren't allowed to present alternative exposure evidence of amphibole exposures as part of their chrysotile defense at trial. In this case, the Illinois Supreme Court held that evidence of plaintiff's amphibole exposure was improperly excluded because the evidence showed that defendant's boiler only contained chrysotile, and plaintiff's trial expert agreed that chrysotile is less potent than amphibole asbestos, and there's considerable disagreement with whether chrysotile exposure can cause mesothelioma. So here, even though it wasn't at trial, the chrysotile was influential in helping win an appeal of a case in a case involving the differentiation between a chrysotile mineral exposure versus the amphibole asbestos mineral exposure. And Juni v. A.O. Smith Water Products, it's not a per se chrysotile defense case. However, it is a good setup for the implications of what could be or what could come down the pipeline in asbestos litigation should EPA promulgate or finalize its risk evaluation for asbestos in its current draft form. The Juni decision is actually the asbestos precedent for causation in the NICAL docket that, of course, everyone is probably well aware of. It's being has one of the largest caseloads filed every year throughout the country. In the Juni case, the case involved chrysotile friction products, so brakes, and the parties, though, did agree that chrysotile could cause mesothelioma, but the court said that it still did not relieve the plaintiff's burden to prove general and specific causation. And again, in this case, going back to the term visible dust, was not satisfactory to plaintiff's burden of proving general or specific causation in this case. Like I said, good transition to the implications. The potential effects of EPA finalizing its draft risk evaluation for asbestos in its current form. Basically, it could further bolster plaintiff's theories of causation, whether it be visible dust theories that we've gone through in prior cases, particularly talking about problematic jurisdictions. Currently in NICAL right now, there are 2 cases in lower appeals courts that are seemingly going to bring back a visible dust standard to NICAL, when right now a plaintiff still has the burden to prove a general threshold limit and then prove how the plaintiff's own individual exposure meets or exceeds that general threshold limit. In Illinois, the Daniels v. Arvin Metter case is actually a case that came after the Nolan case that I just went over. The plaintiff law firms seemingly realized their errors in their own trial and came back and proved a cumulative exposure type theory. In this case, differentiates and was actually, it didn't overrule Nolan, it distinguished the type of facts of what plaintiffs, of what a successful plaintiff's burden would be. And also in another type of theory that could be bolstered by the EPA's draft risk evaluation being finalized in its current form would be the single fiber or each and every exposure theory. Two theories that in Pennsylvania, where the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh courts are, California, where you have San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Alameda courts are, plaintiff counsels are allowed to put forward those single fiber or each and every exposure theories to satisfy plaintiff's burden of causation in these cases. Now, the chrysotile defense is incredibly helpful for defendants to defend against each type of these potential causation theories. However, if EPA, a regulatory body that's very distinguished and mission is to protect against clean air, water, and soil, finalizes its draft risk analysis in its current form, it could weaken the chrysotile defense as to whether there really is a threshold limit value for chrysotile asbestos in particular. In which case, that would tip the scales in favor of plaintiffs in terms of early resolution, and of course, the dreaded raising of settlement values. And also, as a collateral, the EPA, in finalizing its draft risk evaluation in its current form, could set a precedent for other agencies looking at regulating asbestos. And in particular, right now, the FDA is looking at regulating talc and asbestos. And so going forward, a few key things to keep in mind. Submitting comments to the EPA regarding its SAC nominees, which are due by November 30th. Looking at the list of approximately 61 nominees, Laura Plunkett jumped off the page to me as someone who is a known plaintiff expert in ovarian cancer talc litigation right now. The point of submitting comments and objecting to certain nominees, whoever they might be, would reduce bias and increase the public confidence in what EPA is doing right now. If EPA's current draft is finalized, it really would throw a wrench in the mix of, hey, what has all the science previously told us that we thought chrysotile is not as dangerous as amphibole? You know, it could lessen public confidence in what the chrysotile defense actually is. And that turn could sway juries to the plaintiff's side. Secondly, continue to be proactive and monitor regulatory actions, monitor further action by EPA and FDA, and consider participating in public hearings on these influential issues. For instance, earlier this year, pre-COVID, I had the opportunity to travel with one of the partners of my firm, Jennifer Carson, to EPA or FDA open hearing on talc and asbestos. And she spoke quite eloquently regarding the need for science to be unbiased and to not be moved forward by litigation. In that sense, to keep public confidence in the science that is currently out there and not make too drastic of changes where folks that aren't as learned as Evan or Alan might not understand why changes are being made and have difficulties understand what the risk really is if too drastic of a change is made at one time. And thirdly, just promote communication amongst your defense teams. Everyone across the board on this, not just between lawyers and law firms, but also communication amongst the experts, people such as Alan and Evan. Communication between everyone on a defense team only promotes the sharing of current information, new information that comes in at the quickest, most concise way. And everyone can digest that information in the best possible way for the client's benefit. Thank you very much, everyone. That is my individual presentation. I will open the floor up to some question and answers over there. We did receive a few questions in advance. First question I will put to Alan comes from John Dupuis. Can you please speak to what other magnesium silicates could be commonly mistaken for asbestos?
Well, it's interesting in asbestos-containing products, you're not likely to come across some of the lookalikes or analogs. They do occur. Things like when you say magnesium silicates, you're limiting the asbestos type typically to chrysotile or enthophyllite. They would have the similar chemistries. So some of the other interference minerals could be things like sepiolite, which is a clay mineral, talc. Talc fibers versus enthophyllite is a very common error. And there are a few other minerals, chlorite, lizardite is platy, but integrite is fibrous, can be mistaken for chrysotile. So those are just a few examples.
Thank you. And next question, I think would be best for either Alan or Evan. Have either of you recently heard any, either out of EPA or another regulatory body looking at asbestos in some way regarding changing the definition of asbestos to be inclusive of non-asbestiform as well as asbestiform?
From my keeping tabs, NIOSH is the only agency that has sort of looked at the roadmap that they've completed in 2011. There was some consensus to maybe count fibers that are either asbestiform or non-asbestiform to quantify everything that might be in the sample. But the jury's still out, if you will, on do the smaller fibers cause disease. So I think it's still in limbo from NIOSH perspective. I haven't heard anything about EPA.
And Evan, do you have you heard anything with regard to drastic changes, and even something like that, to include non-asbestiform again as a regulated form of asbestos with the asbestiform?
I would second Alan. I have not heard anything, but I, just thinking about that issue, it would have pretty major implications. But in terms of, whether or not those types of fibers, non-asbestiform fibers, would be persistent in the lung if inhaled, my thoughts would be that they would not be due to the underlying structure. But in terms of whether or not they're planning to broaden their definition of what constitutes, a fiber of toxicological importance, I'm not aware of any.
Well, I have a question for Alan. We had a really good conversation when we were planning this. You talked about the opinion that EPA has with regard to environmental exposures. I guess less of a question, more, could you describe for us what, from your professional experience, might be that led you to have some comment on the EPA's finding that there is limited to no environmental exposure risk?
Sure. Well, I've had quite a bit of experience in the field with environmental exposures or potential environmental exposures. Recently in Sicily, you may have heard of the fluoroedenite, the rock quarry, the Biancavilla rock quarry. They crushed this rock, they lined various roads with it. They put it in building materials. And the disease rate was for mesothelioma was very high. For for a lot of the residents in the town of Biancavilla. You know, you can also see some potential exposures. The Calaveras Dam is a recent example in California where they came across a major chrysotolite and amphibole vein of rock, hundreds of feet thick, and had implications for the community downstream when the water fills this reservoir. There's another one. And then I've seen other things like in Virginia where they may have built a strip mall and they were grading the land and they came across significant chrysotile formation. So those are just a few examples off the top of my head.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to actually consider that, you know, clearing land, you come across a schist or a deposit of asbestos. Question for Evan. Could you go over a little bit of the risk models and just tell us a little bit, some more of the specific criticisms you have of the risk models that were used by the EPA? What additional studies would you like to see if you were sitting on the SAC committee?
Sure. Well, you know, aside from what I covered related to the exposure response relationship and how they essentially assumed that the relationship is linear, which is somewhat a default for regulatory agencies. But given the availability of published exposure response data out there, and the fact that they did not even cite to those data is problematic. So if, for example, if I were sitting on the SAC committee, I would absolutely make sure they were aware of those data. But I think just taking a step back, one of the big issues related to this evaluation is that it's very clear they did not make an attempt to validate their own model against any of the existing literature out there. And specifically, you know, this is very apparent when you look at automobile mechanics. Even if they were to be exposed moving forward through the use of asbestos-containing products like brakes and clutches, there's overwhelming evidence in the literature suggests that they would not be at an increased risk for disease. So I would point them to all of the toxicological studies that describe the lack of risk associated with fibers less than 5 microns. The fact that brake wear debris and just brake debris, there are tox studies that evaluate those specific exposures that do not present an increased risk. Consistently, exposure levels are below any existing regulatory benchmarks, such as the OSHA permissible exposure limit. And I would point to all of the studies that were actually collected, or that collected exposure data that were published by the federal government in NIOSH. They just simply disregarded those exposure data. And the fact that, you know, the cumulative exposures are just magnitudes below levels, even in epidemiological studies, at which risk occurs. So you can't really compare apples to oranges here. And so ultimately, they did not perform an assessment or a validity assessment of their own model. And frankly, like if you go back to just comparing cumulative exposure to ambient air, and that being an increased risk for mesothelioma, according to their model, I think that tells you all you need to know about some of the assumptions that they've made here. And so frankly, I don't really see how this is a good use of taxpayer dollars, frankly. And I think some of their approaches were a little bit naive. I don't know if the firm or whoever performed this analysis aren't aware of some of the breadth of the literature around asbestos. It's extremely intimidating how large the literature base is, but it's very clear that they don't have a good handle on the existing literature. And I think, you know, somebody had a question in the question and answer whether or not EPA tends to accept these comments. I submitted comments to EPA along with some of my colleagues, and I know that several other prominent risk assessors in the field of asbestos, including Dennis Postenbach and Mulgav Kar from Exponent. And we all kind of touched on the exact same issues that are very apparent to us as asbestos risk practitioners that apparently weren't apparent to EPA. So, you know, I think hopefully they take those comments to heart and refine their analysis, but I'm not particularly optimistic about that.
Well, you kind of answered the follow-up question I had for you, whether you have seen anything or you feel like they're going to close that gap or try to fill that gap of data. It doesn't seem like you're too confident that they will go that far. But actually, guys, final question for both of you. Given this is a political year, on November 3rd, we won't go into what's going on in Washington. Just ironic that it falls like that. Do you see any political influence that's going to guide the EPA to finalize their risk evaluation in a certain form? We'll start, Evan, with you, and Alan will end with you.
Sure. You know, I don't really have any insight in terms of whether or not this will be affected. I know that EPA is up against a deadline according to the regulation, which is still going to be law no matter what happens in the election. And I mean, I would tend to think that they would push forward with the draft as it stands if the president changes, but it very well may stay the same if Mr. Trump stays in office.
Sorry, but any political influence, whether it be any type of lobbying or not just the change in administration. Sorry.
Oh, I think I would answer the same way. Okay. I'm not sure. It's hard to know. I know that EPA staff are very proud of some of the work that they do, and they are very proud to be uninfluenced by political pressure. And so I would expect the staff there to really push forward with what they have currently in the draft.
I'd like to offer a couple of comments on that. In my experience as a subcontract laboratory in my previous employment, there was a lot of discontinuity with EPA projects. For example, a researcher would take it on, 3 years into it, they may retire, and then someone else would pick up the flag and almost start over in many respects, or it would just get dropped. The second thing is that organizations like ASTM have been a very good tool for scientists to get together with asbestos methods and try to advance through consensus methods, preparation and analysis techniques. And what I have seen over the last probably 15 years is EPA starting to rely on what comes out of ASTM, simply because EPA doesn't really have that mandate to do that type of research. So they're relying on industry or, you know, scientists that volunteer their time, and then sort of marry with that for things going forward. So that's something that I think many can join ASTM and try to look at the science and weigh in on that from a voting perspective.
Understood. Well, thank you both, Evan and Alan, very much for participating and sharing your insights and knowledge. And thank you, everyone, for listening in. I apologize, we went over about 17 minutes. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to email any of the three of us. We have our information available. Again, thank you very much, and we hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Hope this was very helpful for you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.